Okay, hi everybody. We have a small shiur today. We are, as Rosh Hashem, starting something a little bit new. Baruch Hashem, we finished the Evan Shleima over around 2.5 years. And then for Elul, and a little bit even after Yom Naram, we were doing the Geras HaTshuva of the Alter Rebbe and the Balatanya. But now we're starting something new, and I was really very mesupik exactly what to do. There are so many, Baruch Hashem, there are so many candidates for it. But I thought maybe we do something from Maharal. And the long-term project, I think, is Derech Chaim, which is his Perish on Pirkei Avos. But maybe to see if Maharal is good for us, we're going to take a shorter Sefer, the Sefer Ner Mitzvah, which is the Maharal's Kuntras on Chanukah. So the hope would be that we would have a few weeks to go over the Ner Mitzvah, and if we see that the Maharal is good for the Olam, then Mr. Hashem will transition to Derech Chaim Pirkei, because that'll be a long-term project. Derech Chaim is a very long parish, and it covers the whole Maseches Avos, so that'll take longer than even the Evan Shleima took. But we'll start with Ner Mitzvah. Ner Mitzvah is a very, very fascinating sefer. It's actually a very beautiful sefer. But it is short, so Be'ezras Hashem, hopefully we'll be able to finish Ner Mitzvah by Chanukah. Just bibliographical detail, the Ner Mitzvah is normally printed together with Ohr Chadash. Ohr Chadash is Maharal's Perish on Megillah. So Chanukah Purim are the two Yamim Tovim Midrabana. They're not Asher B'Melacha, but they're special days that are Midrabana. The Maharal connected them together. But if you look at it, you'll see that the Ohr Chadash and Megillah is much larger than the Ner Mitzvah. The Ner Mitzvah is taka short. Now, the thing about the Ner Mitzvah that's important is that the Maharal gets into the Chanukah Maisa very, very gradually. In fact, Kemat 2/3 of the Sefer is not b'diuk about Chanukah, but it's about the musag of the Arba Malchiyos. And this is very, very, very important. We have Chazal tell us, and the Maharal will take us through many midrashim and even psukim, that there are going to be there have been 4 Malchiyos that are Meshabed Am Yisrael. Now this is not counting Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is before the 4 Malchiyos, but from the time we got to Eretz Yisrael, and then we had a Churban Beis HaMikdash, there's going to be 4 Malchiyos until Bias HaMashiach. And Chazal identify these Malchiyos as Bavel, Babylonia, Iraq, Paras, Persia, which is modern-day Iran, Yavan, Greece, which of course will be the story of Chanukah, and Edom. Edom is Esav, but Chazal identify Edom as Rome, the Roman Empire. So we go through Bavel, we go through Paras, we go through Yavan, we go through Edom. And obviously the story of Chanukah is going to be focused on Golus Yavan. And the aside of the Maharal is going to be, more or less, that even though we're not under Yavan is not ruling us today, Greece, but nevertheless he's going to show that within the big Golus Edom, there are going to be aspects of Bavel, Paras, and Yavan that are still there. And in Mela, we focus on these different aspects of Goliath as we go through life. So he will eventually get to Chanukah, which is Golus Yavan, but before he gets to Chanukah, he wants to be masber generally the inyan of the four Malchiyos. Right? The 4 Malchiyos are a hachana. They are a preparation for Bias HaMashiach, for the Geula. They are a Tanai in the Geula. Now, the emes is, Maharal does not address it here so much, but this is already a question that the Rishonim asked from the Gemara itself. The Gemara itself makes no reference directly to a Golus of Yishmael, Arabs ruling over us, simply because by the time the Chasima of the Gemara occurred, that was before Muhammad, that was before the Arabian conquest. The Arabs were simply nomads, Bedouins, they were pagans. But the problem was that Chazal clearly seemed to say that the Bias HaMashiach will come at the end of Malchus Edom. And that's why you only have 4. You have Bavel, Paras, Yavan, Edom. Problem is that as history unfolded, we see that Klal Yisrael was meshubed for many, many years under the very, very powerful Islamic empires that are descended from Yishmael. And even today, Lamaisa, if you look at the power of Arab terrorism and Islamic fundamentalism and oil, we're very much meshubed under the Malchus Yishmael. So one of the kashas one has to understand is, why do we say there are 4 Malchiyos? What about the 5th Malchus, which is Malchus Yishmael? And this is already a kasha that the Rishonim asked, the Ramban asks, the Ibn Ezra asks. In fact, because of this, the Ibn Ezra, who does not follow Chazal very often, he's very independent, the Ibn Ezra actually counts the 4 Malchiyos very differently. He counts it like this. He says, Bavel, Paras, number 2. Yavan and Edom are treated as one long one, because Roman culture was largely based on Greek. And the 4th Galus is Taka Malchus Yishmael. That's the Ibn Ezra Shita. But it's a davar pashat that's connected many, many, many chazals, which always talk about the 4th Galus as Galus Edom. So we're going to have to try to figure out, how do you understand that vis-a-vis Galus Yishmael? I'm not going to address it now, but that'll be a question that we have to figure out. The truth of the matter is, the fact that the Maharal begins his story of Chanukah with an analysis of the 4 Malchiyos, the Emes says we see this in the ritual of Hadlakas Neiros itself, right? The Zemer that is very beloved by Hadlakas Neiros is Ma'os Sur, right? Everyone sings Ma'os Sur, or at least says Ma'os Sur. Now, if you look at Ma'os Sur, number 1, is an acrostic. It spells the name of the Mechaber, whose name was Mordechai, not the Mordechai of Purim, but an unknown Mordechai who wrote the Piyut. But if you look at the Piyut, you actually see it is essentially the 4 Malchiyos. In other words, the first stanza, Ma'os Sur, is a general shevach that HaKadosh Baruch Hu redeems his people and takes us out of tzaras. And then the next one is Rais Saval Nafshi. That's referring to Mitzrayim, which is the pre-Galus of the Galus. And then after Mitzrayim, we then have the next Rais Saval Nafshi. Devir Kachay Viani is Bavel, the Churban Beis HaMikdash. Right? So that's Bavel. And the next one is Paras, which talks about Haman, Mordechai Esther. And then the next one is Yevanim Nikvatzu Alai, which is the Chanukah story. And it ends with a tefillah, Chasef Sareya Kachecha, that he should take us out of Malchus Edom, because that's the Galus we were still in. So the emes is, Chanukah itself, the Zemer of Chanukah itself, is about Mitzrayim and the 4 Malchiyos. And Taka, in Ma'os Sur, Taka does not mention Yishmael either. Yishmael is not Nichnas in that. Okay, so the thing that the Maharal starts off with is, before I get to that, let's just be sure we got a little bit of the history right. Not about Chanukah yet, but just the 4 Malchiyos. Klal Yisrael had Yetzias Mitzrayim. 40 years later, we came to Eretz Yisrael. We had the Tekufa of Yeshua ben Nun, and then the Tekufa of the Shoftim for around 300 years. And then we had Shaul HaMelech, David HaMelech, we have Binyan Beis HaMikdash. So let's figure this out just bekitzer. How many years were we in Eretz Yisrael until the Chorban Bayis Rishon? Right, the Chorban Bayis Rishon. How many years? So there's a critical date that is given in the book of Malachim that is the whole yesod to Jewish chronology. This is like the most important date that's given in Tanakh, and that is that Shlomo HaMelech built the Beis HaMikdash 480 years after we left Mitzrayim. State in the Pasuk, 480 years. So let's work backwards. If the Bayis Rishon was 480 after Yetzias Mitzrayim, and we were in the Midbar for 40 years, so in other words, we were in Eretz Yisrael 440 years before the Binyan HaBayis. And Chazal have a Messiah, which you can figure out by adding up all the kings. that the Bayis Rishon was made 410 years. So it's a very simple cheshbon. From the time Yehoshua ben Nun crossed the Yarden until the Chorban Bayis Rishon is what? 850 years. 440 plus 410. 850 years. Now, those were not totally peaceful years. I mean, number one, we split into two kingdoms, the Aseres Hashvatim and the southern kingdom. Number two, the 10 tribes were exiled more than 100 years before the Chorban Bayis Rishon, right? So when I say Klal Yisrael was in Eretz Yisrael 850 years, that's not all of Klal Yisrael. In fact, most of Klal Yisrael was exiled much earlier, but we had the Mikdash was not destroyed until 850 years. Now, Rashi brings from Chazal in the Chanukah, and all of this is really Hakdama material. Rashi brings from Chazal a very, very interesting gematria because the Torah says in Parshas V'Yeschanan, and this is the Kriyas HaTorah on Tisha B'Av, Ki Sailed Banim Uvnei Banim B'nei Shantem B'Aretz. Hashem is telling us, when you have children and grandchildren B'nei Shantem, and you have been in the land a long time, and you will turn to Avodah Zarah, Hashem says, Ha'idesi b'chem hayom, I'm giving you warning, Ki avoid tavidon maher, you will be utterly destroyed. So Rashi brings, if you look at the gematria of V'nei Shantem, it should be 852 years. I always forget if that's counting the Vav or not. Let me just see what I'm saying. Vav and Nun is 56. Shin is 356. 50 is 406. 806. And 40, one second. One second. 56 and 6 is 62, 362. 1 second. And 90. 452. Yeah, 852. Yeah, with the Vav. If you include the Vav, V'nei Shantem is 852. So Chazal make a remarkable observation. The Eibishter destroyed the Beis HaMikdash 2 years earlier than he should have, because the Chorban should have been Keminyan V'nei Shantem, which is 852, when in point of fact the Chorban was after 850. Now you might think that's cruel. The Eibishter took away 2 years we were entitled to. So Rashi says no. Had we been Mekayim V'nei Shantem, then the pasuk says, Avay Taved in Maher, you'll be utterly destroyed. The Eibishter was makdim, so to speak, that we didn't get the full measure of Chatoim in order that he would not destroy us legamrei. Okay, so we should have been 852. We were taka only 850. Okay, so who destroyed the Bayis Rishon? So the Churban Bayis Rishon is in Tanakh. It's right, the end of the book of Malachim, the end of the book of Yirmiyahu, the end of the book of Divrei Hayamim. The Chorban was through Nebuchadnezzar, and that's the Malchus Bavel. Malchus Bavel, right? So the one who was Machriv was Malchus Bavel. That's why it's counted as the first of the 4 Goliaths. Now, Nebuchadnezzar ruled over us, and many things happened. But Lamaisa, eventually Nebuchadnezzar was succeeded by his son Evil Merudach, and Evil Merudach was succeeded by his son Belshazzar. So from the time of the Churban, you only have 3 Babylonian kings. You have Nebuchadnezzar, you have Evil Merudach, you have Belshazzar. There is a machlekes: is Belshazzar Evil Merudach's son, or is Belshazzar his brother and is a younger son of Nebuchadnezzar? That's a machlekes. By the way, remember that Belshazzar was actually the father of Vashti, who became the Persian queen. Okay. Now, in the book of Daniel, which describes Daniel, Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah in Bavel, shortly after the Chorban Bayis Rishon, So it's recorded, an amazing story, that Belshazzar took the kalim of the Beis HaMikdash. Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar is dead already. Belshazzar took the kalim of the Beis HaMikdash. He made a big mishta celebrating, and all of a sudden, there is handwriting on the wall. A huge hand comes out, it's become an English expression, and inscribes letters on the wall in Ksav Ashuris, the Ksav of the Sefer Torah. They didn't know how to interpret it. They got Daniel to interpret, and the letters are said in Aramaic, which was the language of even the Goyim. That was the language of Bavel. Minei, minei, takal, uparsin. Minei, minei, your deeds have been counted and recounted, and you have been found chaser. Tikal, you have been weighed in the scale, so your averos are much greater than your whatever zechus you have. Uparsin, and that's a double meaning. Parsin means your kingdom shall be split, or it also is a reference to the Persians. So, what always gets me is it mentions that Belshazzar hears this, that his kingdom is over. And it mentions, he just went to sleep for the night afterwards. Like you wonder, first of all, you see this whole Mara, he goes to sleep, like no big deal. And what happened that night, that very night, there was a bloodless coup, except for him dying, meaning to say, he had some servants who were in conspiracy with Persia. Belshazzar was killed, and the Persian Empire succeeded to the Babylonian Empire by killing Belshazzar. Took it over. Okay? So, at this point, we transition from Golus Bavel to Golus Paras. But you understand, Golus Paras did not conquer Eretz Yisrael. Bavel conquered Eretz Yisrael. Paras took over by killing. In fact, it wasn't even a war with Bavel, by just killing the king. And they took over. So I'm going to have to mention a few more names here. The first king of Bavel, of Paras, who took over as soon as Belshazzar was killed, his name was Daryavish. And in fact, he's Daryavish Hamadai. It's interesting. In the Megillah Esther, we read Paras Umadai. So they were sister states. The Gemara explains in Maseches Megillah that sometimes they would alternate. Sometimes the Persian king would be from Madai, sometimes would be from Paras. It is called, both of them, Paras and Madai, are nichlal in Malchus Paras. Okay? So the first king was Daryavish Hamadai. He's also called Daryavish Harishan. You'll see. And he ruled for a very short time, less than a year. He died. Did he die naturally? Was he killed? You never know. A lot of times they would kill kings, they'd poison kings, whatever it is. He was succeeded by Koresh, Koresh. Now, Koresh issued a hachraza. This is the very end of Divrei Hayamim, allowing the Yidden who want to return to Eretz Yisrael and he even gave them rishus to build the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, Cyrus gave them permission to build the Beis HaMikdash. This was 52 years after the Churban. So the whole Nebuchadnezzar, Evel Merudach, Belshazzar, Daryavish Harishon, beginning of Koresh's Hachraza. It's not 70 years, it's 52 years after the Churban. Yidden were given permission to return to Eretz Yisrael and rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. And this is the story in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah of Yidden returning. Here's the thing. Very few Yidden came back. In the book of Ezra, we read only 40,000, which is barely 10% of the population, came back. Most Yidden didn't go back. And in fact, the Gemara in Yuma is mashma that had more of Klal Yisrael been willing to come to Eretz Yisrael, perhaps that could have been the Geula Shlema. That could have been Mashiach. That could have been, But people weren't interested. A lot of people are Madamid like today, but they weren't interested.
Where was it?
They were in Bavel, or Paras, different countries. Bavel, Paras, other countries. But they didn't want to come out. Because keep in mind, Eretz Yisrael was totally destroyed. It was destroyed. It mentions that people who came back, it was a totally desolate land, a dangerous land. But it does say that the small group of people who came back, they were Zeicha to lay the foundation in Koresh's reign, of a new Beis HaMikdash. And it even mentions they brought korbanos. This is the Bayit Sheni. It wasn't even a Beis HaMikdash, just they built a Mizbeach according to Chazal. They had curtains for a temporary Beis HaMikdash. They could bring korbanos and the like. Okay? So this was a small group of people who were Zeicha to a Chanukah Sabayas based on the Rishayin, the permission that was given to them by Kairish. What then happens, this is recorded in the book of Ezra, is that there were Goyim who were very, very jealous of the Jews. They saw the Jews kind of moving in on their land, like we have today, building a Beis HaMikdash. So they malshin, they sent a slander to Kairish, saying the Yidden are building a Beis HaMikdash to be a military base to rebel against you. Rashi brings from Chazal that the people who actually wrote the Sitna is the accusation, were actually the Aseres B'nai Haman, not Haman. The Aseres B'nai Haman were the ones who were instrumental in writing this accusation. And as a result, Kairish issued an order that the Beis HaMikdash would have to stop. It could not be rebuilt. In the middle of the construction, he ordered, can't do it. And it remains incomplete for the next 18 years. That's why you get 70, because 52 plus 18 is 70. But we were given permission to go back to Eretz Yisrael after 52 years. And in fact, the governor, the manig of Klal Yisrael, who was kind of like the melech, although he wasn't the melech, is a man called Zerubbabel, right? That's why it says in Mos Sur, Kates Bavel, Zerubbabel. The end of the Babylonian exile was Zerubbabel. And it's clear from Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi that Zerubbabel could have been Mashiach. He could have been Mashiach. Just the door was not Roy Lakach because they didn't care enough to come back. Okay, so now I'm going to take it a little further story. Korich dies. He is succeeded by his son-in-law, who is a well-known person, Achashverosh. This is the Achashverosh of Megillas Esther fame. Okay? You see where all this fits in? Meaning, the story of Purim is during the 70 years of the Babylonian exile, but towards the end of it. Meaning the last years of it's called the Babylonian, although Persia is ruling at this point, but it's called the Babylonian exile. And Rashi indeed says, that Achashverosh was the king in which there was Bittul Beis HaMikdash B'Yama. But again, Rashi doesn't mean Achashverosh was Mavatal. The truth is, Kairish was Mavatal. But Achashverosh continued that restriction. That's why Rashi says when Achashverosh doesn't know if Esther is Jewish or not, but he says, Esther, I'll give you anything you want. Ad chatzi amalchus v'seyos. I'll give you up to half the kingdom. So Rashi brings a chazal, I'll give you up to half, but not half, meaning the Beis HaMikdash is like the middle of the world. So I'm not going to give you, he doesn't know she's Jewish, but he's chayshish, maybe she is, and maybe she'll ask to build the Beis HaMikdash. He says, no, I'll give you up to the thing in the middle, but not the thing in the middle. Okay? So the whole Purim story happens towards the end of those 18 years from the time Koresh annulled. Now, we have the Purim story. Achashverosh dies. Now that's already not in the Megillah Esther. Megillah Esther doesn't tell me Achashverosh dies, but eventually he dies. He is succeeded by his son, who is called Daryavesh Hasheni, Darius II. Now, it does not say it in Tanakh, but Chazal were makabel, an amazing thing, that Daryavesh Hasheni was a son that Esther had from Achashverosh, which actually means Daryavesh Hasheni was a Jew. Was he from? Did he consider himself a Jew? We don't know exactly. Chazal debate, was he a melech kosher or not? If he was a melech kosher, and he was Jewish, that only makes sense if he lived like a Jew. I mean, we wouldn't call... I don't know if Chazal would have used the lashon melech kosher for a Jew who thought he was a guy. It's not pashut, but it is a pella. It's kind of a... They say God has a sense of humor, because Daryavesh Hasheni lifted the ban on the Binyan Beis HaMikdash, and it was under his rule that the Bayis Sheni was built. Shortly after the death of Achashverosh, Daryavesh Hasheni, which means we have a total of 4 Persian kings in Nach. We have Daryavesh Hamadai, who's Daryavesh Arishain. We have Koresh. We have Achashverosh. We have Daryavesh Hasheni. Daryavesh, and that whole period lasted around 50 years. It's a short. So Galus Bavel, 70. Well, okay, that's also a little complicated because part of the 70 also includes Persian years. But B'sach HaKol, you have 70 years from Chorban Bayis Rishon to Binyan Bayis Sheni. And the whole Tekufa of Persia, starting from Darius Rishon, is only around 52 years. It's a short period. Now, that is recorded in Nach. In the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, we do have the reign of Daryavesh Hasheni. Doesn't say he's the son of Esther, but and we do have Chanukah Sabayis, the dedication of the Beis HaMikdash, etc. And we even have a few years after that. Ezra and Nehemiah actually came to Eretz Yisrael a year after the finishing of the Beis HaMikdash. They were not there when the Beis HaMikdash was finished. They came the next year. But that is as far as the biblical period goes, meaning the biblical period, the Tekufa of Nach, Nevi'im and Kesuvim, it ends more or less with the building of the Bayis Sheni under the Malchus of Daryavesh Hasheni. That's it. The story of Chanukah is not in Nach. Okay. So now we're moving into the post-biblical period, meaning the period that is after Tanakh, and also meaning it's also after Nevuah, because the MS is the last Nevi'im who were given the Kayach of Nevuah are Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, and they were at the very beginning of the Bayis Sheni, meaning for most of the Hemshech of the Bayis Sheni, there was no Nevuah Bichlal. So Daryavesh ben Esther, Daryavesh Hasheni, ruled for a very long time. Although the Mikdash was finished in the 6th year of his reign, that we know from the book of Ezra, but he ruled for more than 30 years. So he ruled quite a long time. And the end of that reign is not discussed in Tanakh, okay? But what happens, the Seif Yamav, or maybe in the reign of his son, a man, Alexander Muktan. So history calls him Alexander the Great, although we don't consider him particularly great as in righteousness. But Macedonia was a little country right next to Greece, and Alexander's father, Philip, was king of Macedonia, and he had a very talented son, Alexander, who became a world conqueror. And just to show you, Alexander was very, very bright. He was not only physically very talented, he was very brilliant, and his father wanted him to have a good education. So quite amazingly, just shows you what money can get you. There was no Harvard, Yale, Stanford in those days, but he did something better. He got Aristotle to be his private tutor. Aristotle, the Chachmei Umos HaOlam, was the greatest of the greatest of the greatest of the Chachamim of the Umos HaOlam. And Philip hired Aristotle to be Alexander's private tutor for a while. Okay. Be it as it may, Alexander grew up. He succeeded his father as king of Macedonia. But then he embarked on world conquest. And he conquered the great Persian Empire, which was even larger than the Babylonian Empire. He waged, now this was a war. This was not like, Persia took over Babylon in an easy way. They just killed Belshazzar and that was it. Alexander waged a very, very long war, but eventually he was victorious. So once again, you have to understand, the way Alexander conquered Eretz Yisrael was not by conquering Eretz Yisrael, it was by conquering the Persian Empire. Memela, you own whatever is Niklal in the Persian Empire. Now, this is the beginning of Yavan, because although Alexander technically was not Yavan, but number one, he became king of Yavan, he conquered Yavan. Number two, culturally he was Yavan, Aristotle and the like. So this is the beginning of the Tekufa of Malchus Yavan. And that lasted for a long time. We'll talk a little bit about that. But again, the point to know is, although we have many Ramazim in Nach regarding the Arba Malchias, but the actual history of Malchus Yavan on Eretz Yisrael is after Tanakh. It's not within the Sefer Nach itself. Now, the Gemara in Yuma tells us that Alexander was initially a benign ruler. Alexander didn't, he conquered you had to pay taxes to him, but he didn't care if you're keeping mitzvahs, whatever it is, that was your own thing. Whatever you wanted to do, you can do. Alexander didn't care about that. But once again, people had told him that the Yidden are trying to rebel, so it's recorded that he sent an army against Yerushalayim to destroy the Mikdash and to destroy the city. The Kohen Gadol at the time was Shimon HaTzadik. Right? Our street, Shimon HaTzadik, the Kever Shimon HaTzadik. And it mentions that Shimon HaTzadik came out in his Big Day Kahuna. So how was he allowed to wear Big Day Kahuna outside of the Mikdash? But in his Big Day Kahuna, to be Mavakesh Rachamim from Alexander. And when Alexander saw Shimon HaTzadik, Alexander got off his horse and he bowed down and he said, "You are the person I see in my dreams that tells me if I will be Menatzeach in Milchama or I will not be Menatzeach." Because he was the one that Hashem sent to Alexander. And because of Alexander's admiration for the greatness of Shimon HaTzadik, he did not destroy Yerushalayim, and that day became a Yom. That day, that day became a Yom Tov, and the Gemara says that year, every boy that was born was given the name Alexander. And that is how, although Alexander is a Greek name, it's not a Hebrew name, but it's considered to be a Shem Kodesh because Yidden were makabel that name. So you can be called to the Torah. If your name is Alexander, you could be called to the Torah Alexander. That's considered to be a Shem. You see an interesting idea. That itself is an interesting halacha, that you see that.
You do it to Trump too?
Huh?
You do it to Trump?
What Trump?
Starting giving...
Oh, yeah, right, yeah, Donald, Trump, whatever. I mean, it's an interesting idea that if just because we adopt a secular name, so it becomes a Shem Kodesh, I mean, could we do that today? Like, does it require Chazal to authorize it? Like, how do you kind of bring a name and make it a Shem Kodesh? But the Gemara says Alexander became a Shem Kodesh in the sense that you could be Eilul the Torah with that name. Now, Alexander conquered virtually the whole known world. The Persian Empire, number one, just as the Gemara says, or Megillah says, Achashverosh ruled over Meya v'Yesrim, Sheva u'Meya v'Yesrim, 127, meaning like the whole world, basically. And Alexander succeeded to that, and he conquered more countries. The Gemara in Talmud says he went down to Africa. He conquered different countries in Africa. The Gemara even has a story that he met a community of Amazons, meaning a malchus that was ruled all by women. I'm not sure. I mean, there must have been men, even if they were slaves. Otherwise, they couldn't have children. But the men were slaves. The women were ruling over everything. And the Gemara in Talmud has a Shakavataria debates Alexander had with the women over different things. He asked them to make bread for him. So they gave him gold in the shape of bread. So he said, I can't eat this as well. He says, you didn't come here for the bread, you came here for the gold, so take the gold and get out of here, whatever. Okay. Now, it happens to be that Alexander died very, very young. Alexander died, amazingly, he died at 31 or 32. 31 or 32. The legend that was meforshim among the Greeks is that he died out of heartbreak because he said he had no more worlds to conquer. As he conquered the world. I mean, he didn't conquer America, but they didn't know about America, whatever. But the whole known world was under his shalita, right? This is Alexander, so the legend has it. Oh, I conquered everything. There's nothing else for me to do with the rest of my life. Sometimes it's similar to the problem with presidents. Like if you're a president of the United States, like, what do you do the rest of your life? Like Obama. So if you're an old guy, all right, so you're ready to retire. But sometimes, like Obama, president is a young person, so like, what do you do afterwards? Okay, whatever. In reality, what probably happened was one of two things happened. Either Alexander caught a plague, a disease in Africa that killed him, or some say he was poisoned. He was poisoned because people wanted there's quite a big malchus to take over. Now, Alexander, did he have children? What happens after? Remember, this is still called Yavan. Did he have children? Yeah, he had a baby. A young baby. Only one. And that young baby, his wife's name was Roxanne. Okay, the young baby would have taken over everything. But somehow, mysteriously, the young baby seems to have gotten ill and died very soon after Alexander's death. Again, it's almost borrowed.
He also realized he has nothing to conquer.
Yeah, but it's almost borrowed. The baby was poisoned. So now we're still into Kufas Yavan, but I'm now going to show you where Chanukah fits into this. When Alexander died, huge empire, the whole world, including Eretz Israel, the whole world. When Alexander died, who's going to take over? There are no kids. The only heir died. The only Yerush died. So Alexander had 4 big generals. And the generals made a Chanukah. which means nobody got the whole empire. The generals divided the empire into 4 chalakim. For purposes of Jewish history, which is what we're interested in, we're only going to look at 2 out of the 4 generals. One general's name was Talmai. That's spelled in English like Pitom, P-T-O-L-M-E-Y, Talmai. And he established the Ptolemaic dynasty. And that was Egypt and North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, the modern countries, right? So Egypt, North Africa, that part of the empire was taken over by Ptolemy. And then there was another general whose name was Seleucus, who took over Syria, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Persia, right? And now that started the Seleucid dynasty. Ptolemaic dynasty, Seleucid dynasty. Now, if you can envision this in a map, you should be able to see that Eretz Yisrael is right between these 2 empires. Ptolemy is Egypt, North Africa. Seleucus is Syria, Turkey, Iran. Eretz Yisrael is in between. For over 100 years, there were great milchamas between the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Seleucid dynasty. And Eretz Yisrael was quite literally a football. Now this is still called Yavan, because whether it's under the Ptolemaic dynasty or the Seleucid dynasty, it's still Yavan. See, this explains something that people often have a question. We say Antiochus is persecuting us, and that represents Yavanim. What's the Yavanim? They're Syria. Antiochus is Syria. Why is it called Yavanim? It's not. They didn't come from Greece. The answer is because they're the Yorshim of Alexander, who came from Greece. Their culture, their philosophy, was all Greek. They weren't living in Yemen. Okay? So, Eretz Yisrael is going between the Ptolemaic and the Seleucus. Some years, it's under one ruler. Some years, it's under another ruler. Didn't make a big difference to us. I mean, it wasn't great no matter who it was. So it wasn't that the Yidden in Eretz Yisrael, I mean, unfortunately, they were subject to all these wars, but they were not in the wars. They were just, these 2 rival empires were fighting, and Itaka didn't make a big nafkamina at that point, but Eretz Yisrael was a big, big, big battleground, political football. It was not a war against the Jews at that point. It was not a war against the Yidden. It was a war between the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid. Now, just to give you, again, a little bit of a sense of the history, the capital of the Ptolemaic dynasty was a city in Egypt called Alexandria. Named after Alexander of Macedonia. In fact, he named the city himself. He named the city after himself. And the Jews in Alexandria, or in the whole, were very assimilated Jews. They were very wealthy. They were very politically well-connected. But they were not necessarily that from. Very, very assimilated. Many didn't even know Hebrew. The Gemara, remember the Gemara in Sukkah discusses, and it's referring to this time, this period of time. Remember, we have a Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, right? The Beis HaMikdash is up now. But it talks about the Beis Knesses, the Gemara in Sukkah in Alexandria, was so huge, and the chairs were gold and silver, and it was so big that when the Chazan said a bracha, they had to wave a flag to answer Amen. You have to know a little bit that Chazal are being, I don't have a clear raya to this. I think Chazal are being satirical. I think they want to portray that they were so megushim, they were so into Gashmias. In other words, it's portraying it not in admiration. It's portraying it with a little bit of zilzal, that this was not such a makom kadesh. They were so shakua in Taivas and the like. And in fact, this also explains discussions in the Gemara Megillah. The Gemara talks about writing a Sefer Torah in Greek. And you learn a Gemara like that, and you think, huh? I mean, what's the hava meaning? What's the hava meaning of writing a Torah in Greek? Even a Reformed synagogue doesn't write their Torah in English. I mean, they get a Torah. The answer is, this was not hypothetical. Many Jews in Alexandria, including the learned Jews, did not know how to read Hebrew. And indeed, they may have read Kriyas HaTorah in Greek. And Mimela, Chazal had to discuss, halachically, is it kosher, is it not kosher? Right? There was mamash. Now, the famous story of the 70 Zakanim who translated the Torah was in Alexandria, Talmud HaMelech. Now, we don't know which Talmud because there are, this was a name like Paro. It repeated itself over and over again. But remember the story. We know, actually we could, I don't remember which Talmud it was, but we could find it out for sure because this was a Talmud, one of the Talmuds was a great, great book collector. So he built, it was a very, very, the biggest library in the world in which there weren't as many books as today, but every book, like in the world, was supposed to be in his library. This was like a wonder. So he wanted the Torah in his library. So he wanted a translation of the Torah. Right, so the Gemara Megillah. So he took 70 Zakanim. He put them in separate rooms to see what they would come up with. And a miracle happens. And b'diyuk, they came with the exact translation, including the shinuyim, changes that they made, with Ruach HaKodesh. Of course, I've heard it said, a little bit of a joke, but has some truth, that if they would have been in the same room and would have come up with the same thing, that would have been a bigger miracle, machlekes and the like. But they made certain shinuyim. So, for example, one example the Gemara says is that Bereshis bara Elokim, if you follow that word sequence in Greek, it would mean the beginning created God, meaning God was created. So they changed the order. Hashem created Bereshis. Hashem created the beginning. Or, another example, in the list of non-kosher animals, the arneves is listed. Arneves means a rabbit. So apparently the Greek word for rabbit was the same name as Talmai's wife. I think Bernice it comes from rabbit in Greek. So as a result, they didn't want to say Bernice is repulsive, like it says Bernice is tameh, whatever. They didn't want to say that, so they changed it to different shinoyim, whatever it was. And this is called, the name for this is called the Targum HaShivim, the translation of the Torah by the 70 elders. And the Greek term for it is the Septuagint, which actually means the translation of the 70. Now, it's interesting that although, as far as the Gemara and Megillah is concerned, the Chachamim who translated the Torah were Chachamim. I mean, they were Chachamim, they were righteous people. But the Septuagint was not makubal by Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael did not really, we really don't use it. But it became very, very, very makubal in Christianity. So the way the Christians learned the Torah was they learned it from this Greek translation. So the Septuagint actually had a much bigger influence on Goyim, even though it came from us. It had a much bigger influence on Goyim than it has on Yidden. In other words, now we have Targumim, right? We have Targum Onkelos, we have Targum Yonis, and so we do have translations that Klal Yisrael was makabel, but this particular translation did not really become makubal in Am Yisrael. But that happened under Talmai HaMelech. Okay? So now, again, I just want to take you up to Chanukah. So what happens is this. So Alexander conquers. Alexander dies. The two generals, Seleucus and Ptolemy, make their Chanukah. There are two other generals, but their Chanukah are not Nogeya. Us. And then Eretz Yisrael goes back and forth, like a football, over 100 years of fighting. But at some point, Eretz Yisrael is conquered decisively by a Seleucid king whose name is Antiochus. This is not our Antiochus yet. It's his father. And now, that was such a decisive victory that ended the ability of the Ptolemaic dynasty to try to get it back. And when Antiochus the senior dies, he is succeeded by Antiochus the junior, who is the Antiochus of the Chanukah story. All of this is under the Yabban Stekufa. The Antiochus, his father, was a very, very great military leader, and historians call him Antiochus the Great.
Where did he come from?
Well, from Syria. In other words, this is the Seleucid dynasty is in Syria. He was not. No, he was not Greek. As I say, the only reason we call them Greek is because culturally they were Greek. And in fact, there's a city in Syria, which Chazal referred to a lot, Antioch is named after Antiochus, just like Alexandria is named after Alexander. Antioch is a city on of Antiochus. So Antiochus' father, meaning the Chanukah Antiochus' father, is Antiochus the Great. Antiochus the son is not so great, obviously, but he gave himself the title Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes is Greek. Greek was their language. Antiochus Epiphanes means Antiochus the divine. That's what he called himself, Antiochus the divine. But behind his back, they switched a letter. Not the Jews, everybody. Behind his back, they called him Antiochus Epimanes. Not Epiphanes, but Epimanes, which means Antiochus the nuts, the crazy guy. So he was considered to be kind of unstable, even among the Goyim. His father was, his father was no big tzaddik either, but his father was a very disciplined military warrior who was very, very successful in kibush. Antiochus the son was not really of that, even as a political leader. Okay, so I'm just going to end here just with one final thing. Antiochus the son, Antiochus Epiphanes, Epimanes, I hate to call him our Antiochus, just because he's part of our story, was Machadesh something, and people don't realize what a Chiddush it was. He actually was the first king who made gezeros against the practice of mitzvahs. Now let me explain this. We've had plenty of bad guys before. We had Paro, Nebuchadnezzar HaRasha. But you see, they were into money, they were into conquest, they were into enslavement. But they didn't care that much if we kept mitzvahs or not. Nebuchadnezzar, now, sporadically, Nebuchadnezzar would say, you're not allowed to bow, you have to bow down to not my idol. But those were like short-term things to give him kavod. But if afterwards you wanted to put on tefillin or whatever it is, he didn't care. Meaning, we don't always realize this. Not every Russia was specifically trying to take us away from mitzvahs. They had political agendas. They wanted to conquer. They murdered. They did all sorts of atrocities. They were machriv the Beis HaMikdash. But it wasn't to take Jews away from mitzvahs. The very first king who systematically passed laws that Jews should not do mitzvahs, was Antiochus. This is mamash a chiddush. The first it's not anti-Semitic legislation, it's anti-Torah legislation. In fact, in some ways, by the liberal definition, Antiochus was not anti-Semitic, meaning to say, Antiochus was perfectly willing to give equal rights to Jews as long as they didn't keep the Torah. Meaning he treated a native Greek or a native Syrian and a Jew exactly the same. And his deal was, don't keep the Torah and you'll be part of us. So by modern definitions of liberalism, he wasn't anti-Semitic, he was just anti-Torah, anti-God, which in modern terms is not so bad, as it were. Okay, and therefore, okay, I'm going to stop here, but that's the Chanukah story, so to speak. The Chanukah story is the story of Klal Yisrael rebelling against the Gezeros of Antiochus that didn't let us keep the Torah. So it's very, very important to understand that although it is true that as a result of the Chanukah rebellion, we did gain independence. We became an independent country. But the war was not fought as a war of independence. It was fought as a war to enable Shmiras HaMitzvahs. Okay? That's a very important point. It was a war for the right and the ability to keep Torah Hashem. Okay, it was not a war of independence. It's not like the 4th of July or 1948 here in Israel. Okay, it was totally because of Ruchnius. Yeah.
Why was Antiochus so against this?
Yeah. So here you have to understand something. You have to understand that the word Hellas is Greek for Greece. Hellas is so Hellenism, a term that I'm sure you've heard many, many times, simply means the promulgation and the spread of Greek wisdom and culture. Now, Greek wisdom and culture, if you don't look at Torah and Ruchnius, was the greatest chachma in the world, the greatest philosophy, the greatest science, the greatest music, the greatest literature, architecture, sculpture, painting, everything. Hellenism, as Alexander the Great kept on conquering and conquering and conquering, one of Alexander the Great's agendas was to spread the beauty of Hellenist wisdom. Now here's the thing though. Alexander himself, and Ptolemy to some degree, didn't do it by coercion. He did it by assimilation. In other words, he built these buildings and built and these architectures and everything else. So just like in America, people were nimshach after the beauties of this civilization, which is a very beautiful civilization. So Alexander was getting people into Hellenism just by showing them these things, and they forsook the Torah, and he was actually very successful. Antiochus wanted to accelerate the process because there were some holdouts who were still remaining from, and he thought that in order to make Hellenism totally successful, we have to be coercive. But in many, many ways, and this is a real chaval, many Jews were doing it on their own. Meaning to say, there weren't that many Jews who were fighting him. It's estimated that the Chashmonaim and the Maccabim and the whole Jewish army that was going against the Yavanim was only 5% of the population. Can you imagine that? 95% of the Jews were assimilated. They weren't keeping mitzvahs anyway. I mean, that's even worse than today. That's how bad it was. You see. So essentially, Antiochus. Again, I'm talking about this a little more politically than maybe you normally hear it. It's not so much that Antiochus was like a Molech, that he had a hatred to Torah, but he looked at the Torah as something that was blocking the Hellenism and the assimilation that he wanted in creating a homogeneous empire where everybody was doing the same cultural thing. So he invented this idea that let's make laws against Shmiras HaMitzvahs, whether it's Bris Milah, Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh. The Chazal point out the very specific things. Okay? So this is the Reka. This is the background to the Chanukah story, per se, and it occurs during the Tkufa of Malchus Yavan. Now, Antiochus gets defeated, and what then happens is the Jewish people start their own Malchus, which is called Malchus Chashmonai. But it's so interesting. Malchus Chashmonai themselves became Hellenized. So Chazal don't count this. In other words, Chazal count the 100 years of Malchus Chashmonai as part of Malchus Yavan. They don't count it like. In other words, we go from Bavel, Persia, Yavan, and then we go to Edom, and we'll see how Rome gets in. I'll talk about that next week. But we don't say, and there was 100 years where we had our own Malchus. Actually, no. We did have our own Malchus for 100 years. But they themselves became Hellenized.
The kids, right?
The kids, not the original generation. And Memela, in retrospect, Chazal characterized the 100 years of Malchus Chashmonai as just part of Yavan. So we go straight from Yavan to Edom, Esav, Edom, and the like. Okay? So I just want you to get a sense of that history a little bit, because a lot of times it's very, very murky. People don't have a sense of. I didn't give you exact dates. I don't want to overwhelm you with dates, and I also don't remember dates myself. Maybe next week I'll look up some dates and give you some dates. But just to understand the Mahalach. Eventually, the Chashmonaim were conquered by the Romans, and that led to the Golus of Edom, the Churban Bayis Sheni, etc. But remember that everything from after Persia is not in Tanakh. Tanakh ends with the reign of Darius Hasheni, which is before Alexander the Great shows up. Okay, maybe we'll stop here and be well and take care.